Hello, I'm Michael Bunch. I'm the plant pathologist at the North Dakota State University Carrington Research Extension Center. In this presentation, I'll be discussing the relative performance of different fungicides against white mold in soybeans. In this particular presentation, I'll be discussing TOPSIN and the various generic versions of TOPSIN, such as T-methyl, and its efficacy for white mold management in soybeans. I would like to stress that this is an abbreviated summary of comparative fungicide efficacy. I'll only be showing average results across multiple field studies in this presentation. I would strongly recommend that you reference the corresponding PDF document that has the results for individual field studies so you can see how consistently various fungicides performed across studies. This research was conducted calibrating fungicide drop-off size relative to soybean canopy closure. In our tractor applied studies evaluating the impact of fungicide drop-off size on white mold management in soybeans, we have demonstrated that enormous gains can be achieved in fungicide performance by getting your droplet size right, and that the optimal fungicide droplet size is rarely fine. Droplet size needs to be calibrated relative to the degree of canopy closure, and as the canopy gets denser, you need a coarser droplet size. All of this research was done calibrating droplet size on the basis of the recommendations developed in our droplet size research, and I would strongly recommend that you review our findings from our droplet size research before you make any applications of fungicides to soybeans targeting white mold. The improvements in fungicide performance obtained by calibrating droplet size relative to canopy closure are tremendous for white mold management. White mold develops in the interior of the canopy, where fine droplets have a very difficult time penetrating when the canopy is dense. These studies were conducted on soybeans seeded to narrow 14-inch rows. Seeding rate was 140 or 165,000 viable seeds an acre. Spray volume was 15 gallons an acre. We conducted all the individual studies with 6 experimental replicates. What this means is that we randomized the treatments 6 times. White mold was assessed at soybean maturity by evaluating every single plant individually for white mold severity in 1 or 2 rows per plot. This was the full length of the row, every single plant in the length of that row in 1 or 2 rows per plot. Fungicides were applied at 100% R2 in most of the studies. When conditions favored white mold and the canopy closed before 100% R2, the fungicide was applied in conjunction with canopy closure. Okay? When the canopy was still open, once we hit 100% R2, we applied 100% R2 if conditions favored white mold. If conditions did not favor white mold, we waited until R3 to make that application, irrespective of canopy closure. When we made 2 sequential applications, the second application was made 7 to 14 days after the first, depending on the study. These were irrigated studies with irrigation delivered such that we would achieve some degree of white mold pressure. You can only learn about how a fungicide performs against white mold if you get white mold, and thus we irrigated to make sure that we would get some white mold. I'd like to delve into results. TOPSIN and its generics were labeled to allow for single application to soybeans at 40 fluid ounces several years back. This was a label change. Before then, you could only apply TOPSIN as 2 sequential applications at 20 fluid ounces or a single application at 20. And so now the label allows you to make 1 application at 40 fluid ounces. So this is a summary of our results across all those studies where we had high disease pressure and we made 2 sequential fungicide applications, either Endura followed by Endura at 5.5 ounces, or TOPSIN/generic at 40 fluid ounces followed by Endura at 5.5 ounces. What you can see is that TOPSIN followed by Endura delivered really very good disease control, but not as good as Endura applied twice. Okay. In those studies, when we had low disease pressure, that 2 application sequence of Endura or TOPSIN followed by Endura performed virtually identically. What about applying TOPSIN twice at 20 fluid ounces? Well, here are the studies where we evaluated TOPSIN applied twice at that low rate versus Endura at the low rate. What you can see is that the TOPSIN clearly had some degree of efficacy, but it was not as good as the low rate of Endura. So what about those studies where we applied only a single fungicide application? Okay, the timing was the same as I described earlier. If conditions favor white mold as we enter bloom, we applied at 100% R2 or as soon as the canopy closed, whichever occurred first. If conditions did not favor white mold as we entered bloom, we waited until R3. What you can see is that Endura at the low rate versus TOPSIN/generic at the high rate of 40 fluid ounces. Well, that TOPSIN definitely showed efficacy, but it was not as good as Endura. Under low disease pressure, the differences narrowed and were quite negligible. As such, these results parallel very close to what we saw with the 2 application sequence. What about TOPSIN applied at 20 fluid ounces just once? Unfortunately, I did not have a consistent competitor product to compare this to. So what I'm showing you here are all the results from combined results across all the studies where we evaluated TOPSIN generic at 20 fluid ounces as a single application, just versus the control. What you can see is that there appeared to be some degree of efficacy, but it was not very good. And this parallels what we saw when we made 2 sequential applications at 20 fluid ounces. Definitely some degree of efficacy, but not as good as say Endura at the low rate. I'd like to summarize what we've learned before I close. We did not make any head-to-head comparisons of 20 versus 40 fluid ounces of TOPSIN, but if you looked at the relative performance of 40 fluid ounces of TOPSIN versus 5.5 ounces Endura, or the relative performance of 20 fluid ounces of TOPSIN versus 5.5 ounces Endura, you will see very clearly that 40 fluid ounce rate was performing better than the 20 fluid ounce rate. This is consistent with what we have seen in dry beans, where we've done that head-to-head comparison of 20 versus 30 versus 40 fluid ounces of TOPSIN versus Endura. And in that dry bean testing, we've seen that there's a big jump in efficacy of TOPSIN as you will go from 20 to 30 fluid ounces of TOPSIN. And then another jump in efficacy as you go between 30 and 40 fluid ounces of TOPSIN. But the biggest jump in efficacy comes in that 20 to 30 fluid ounce jump. Okay, and so what I would recommend on the basis of this is that if you are planning to apply TOPSIN targeting white mold on soybeans, remember that the maximum application you can make per season is 40 fluid ounces total to soybeans. If you're going to make 2 sequential applications of TOPSIN, of course, then you need to do 20 fluid ounces twice. But if you're planning to do just 1 application of TOPSIN, I would recommend that you do that application at a minimum 30 fluid ounces, but 40 fluid ounces if you can afford it. Because again, in dry beans, we saw an enormous jump in efficacy as we went from 20 to 30 fluid ounces of TOPSIN. And yes, another jump in efficacy, but not quite as large as you went from 30 to 40 fluid ounces of TOPSIN. Now remember that all of our comparisons here have been done versus Endura at the low application rate of 5.5 ounces. Endura also exhibits a rate response, and you should expect even better disease control as you go to 8 ounces of Endura, which we did not test in these studies. Before we close, I'd like to give sincere thanks to Aaron Faust, Sue-Ann Collis, Jesse Hafner, and Gabby Henson, my long-serving staff, as well as our student workers. It's the dedication of these staff members who make this research possible. I'd also like to give my very sincere thanks to the North Dakota Soybean Council, which funded this research evaluating TOPSIN and generics versus Endura, and also the company registrants who also funded some of the research presented in this presentation. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention.